Leader, social advocate, author, and COO, Daniel Blackman is dedicated to creating solutions that lead to real and permanent good. Best known as a pioneer in the environmental movement, Mr. Blackman has been hard at work in social justice for more than a decade. He serves as an advisor working to close gaps in race relations, interfaith initiatives, financial inclusion, and policy making. Please welcome Daniel Blackman.
Sure, law enforcement, the airport, the hotel industry, the legislators, the elected officials are in the same rooms so that we're not having conversations in silo, but we're bringing people together.
Just briefly, what would you say to anyone in the world who suspects that they are with or have seen a victim of sexual trafficking? What can they do in that instance?
If you see something, say something. I know it sounds cliche-ish, but I think we need to be able to, one, go with our instinct, and if we feel uncomfortable, we should do everything in our power to address the closest law enforcement or any person in authority that's trying to address the issue.
All right, Daniel Blackman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right, y'all gotta do better than that. I just drove in an hour and a half. I sat on 400 and 285. So how's everybody doing? Well, it's an honor to be here. Again, my name is Daniel Blackman. The story you just saw, even though I'm gonna talk about justice as a whole and compassion and the responsibility that all of us have, the story you just saw is about my goddaughter. So my goddaughter at 15 years old was abducted and trafficked for 4 years of her life. She's since been rescued, so I know I met law enforcement in the back. Thank you, Sheriff, for the work you do here in Cobb County. But I wanted to explain to you all how justice as a whole affects every aspect of our lives, and then explain our responsibility to addressing justice and being on the front lines of these conversations. Now, first and foremost, I'm going to start off with a quote, which you'll probably get familiar with because I give a lot of quotes. But Dr. King once said that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So when we think of justice, I don't want us to limit justice to what we think, what we understand, or what we think we know. For my goddaughter, it was an issue that many people, quite frankly, didn't know about or didn't talk about, because when most people think of human trafficking, they don't think about what happens in their backyards. They don't think what happens in their cities. They don't think about what happens in their communities. But the challenge is in the United States and in Atlanta, which is unfortunately one of the top cities in the United States for human trafficking, we've seen far too often young men and young women fall victim and unfortunately be sent into or caught up into a lifestyle of this type of tragic situation because they just don't know. For my goddaughter, she met a young man. She thought that she was really, fond of him. And unfortunately, over time, it turned into a deceptive relationship. And the first thing that I want to share with you all, especially as it relates to that, is that these issues are issues that we don't have the luxury to not talk about. As parents, as family members, as community members, I grew up in a West Indian house. So in my family that was from Barbados originally, we had to have conversations about everything. There was nothing that we didn't talk about. And I would encourage all of you to take away from these epic talks, this conversation, your willingness to be bold and courageous in every single thing you do and everything you commit your mind and your heart to. One of the things that I want us to understand as it relates to this, you heard some of the numbers I gave on human trafficking. 1 in 3 women in the world globally are victims of sexual violence and or assault, which includes rape. 2 of those 3 women are women of color. We have to begin to have conversations that are not being held in our communities and that are not being held in our schools, because it's our responsibility to pass on the wisdom, the information, and the knowledge that we all have and that we would hope to share with the next generation. Rather than pointing fingers at that generation, we have to empower that generation, which is exactly, in my opinion, what these conversations are about. So over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I just want to share with you all our personal responsibility to justice. I am an author as well. I'm a published author. I just wrote my first book on nationalism, which obviously is a conversation that we should all be having. And I'll get into that towards the end of this discussion. But I wanted to make sure that I came and painted a broad picture for those who are watching and for those who are here today. First and foremost, another quote from Dr. King is the true measure of a man is not where he stands in times of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. Now, I don't want you to say anything, but I know, just wave your hand at me if you know that we live more in challenging and controversial times. And knowing that and understanding that means that we have a much higher responsibility to our community, to our families, and to our nation. Now, when Dr. King said this quote years ago, he said this quote understanding the tremendous challenges that came with the civil rights movement, the struggle for equality, the struggle for freedom, the struggle for black and brown and poor people in this world to have a fair share. And I'm here to tell you today, first and foremost, focusing on our younger generations, that, ladies and gentlemen, it is our responsibility to convey those messages to these young men and women who we, quite frankly, may think are lost, but they're not lost. They just don't know. They're ignorant to the fact of a lot of things that have happened before them. And they're actually being able to benefit from a lot of the struggles and a lot of the sacrifices that were made. One of my biggest mentors, a gentleman by the name of Reverend Gerald Durley, always tells me that life is about sacrifice and risks. Well, this generation didn't have an Edmund Pettus Bridge. They didn't have a Bloody Sunday. They didn't have a Montgomery bus boycott. Most of the young people I engage and talk to were born in the same year that 9/11 happened. So there's a tremendous amount of history from the 60s where we saw the height of the civil and human rights movement. There's a lot of things that happened in the 70s and even in the 60s with the Voting Rights Act, by the way, which on August 6th of this month, we celebrated the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and all of us know the tremendous responsibility of keeping those intact. And I'm going to get into that as well. But this generation was not born in a time in the 80s with the crack cocaine epidemic and seeing all the things that we've had to face and endure. So it's incumbent upon all of us to share those stories and those responsibilities with these young people. And why? Because our job and our responsibility, I'm not saying everyone's that much older because I know some of you all are a lot younger, amen? But also, I want us to be able to understand that the responsibilities that we face are as conductors. And I use that word conductors very intentionally. Now, Harriet Tubman, we know her very well because of the fact that she is probably the most prominent figure during the times of the Underground Railroad. What most people don't realize about Harriet Tubman was that Harriet Tubman freed over 300 slaves by making over 19 trips and putting her life on the line every time to go back, and even at times for people that didn't want to be rescued, people that didn't want to be helped. Now, I'm a happily married man. I'm a happy father of 3 black boys, and I love it. But I know that there are other young black men and other young black girls and other poor children and other children in general that exist. And if I only focus on my family and on my household, then I'm doing society and our democracy a disservice. And I want to challenge all of you here today to begin to understand the tremendous responsibility that is on all of us as it relates to compassion. Now, compassion is supposed to be fearless. A lot of times when people hear the word compassion, they think that it's a passive word or it's a weak word or it's a word that, doesn't carry a lot of weight. My book is called Nationalism Without Compassion, and I intentionally did that because I understand the role compassion plays in these areas, because compassion is about understanding and making the adjustments necessary. And there were other people that folks didn't know about during the Underground Railroad, and they were conductors, they were abolitionists, and it's our responsibility to be fearless in how we talk to people. It's our responsibility to be fearless in how we talk about justice and the things that we begin to teach the young men and the young women that exist throughout society. So we live, again, in challenging times. Now, I'm happy to see the sponsors that are here and the individuals that are also here to be able to share this day and to share these conversations. I want to talk a little bit about some of those challenging times that we live in. Later on today, you'll hear from Mike Brown Sr. And I live in an area, not to veer off too far, I live in an area, for you all that are familiar with Georgia, Forsyth County, Georgia. I was the first black person to ever run for office in Forsyth County, Georgia. Forsyth County, Georgia is the 6th fastest growing county in the United States. It's the 7th wealthiest county in the United States. There's a lot of great things economically going on in Forsyth County, and it's a great place, coming from me, to raise your family. But in 1987, we were put on the map and on the national stage for all the wrong reasons. You see, in 1987, there was a gentleman by the name of Hosea Williams. Many of you may know Hosea Feed the Hungry. By the name of Hosea Williams, along with Coretta Scott King and other civil and human rights leaders, they traveled up to Forsyth County, Georgia. And when they went to Forsyth County, Georgia, they were met with more than just a displeasure for them being there. They were met with rocks and stones and mobs of people that did not want them to enter into their county because at the time, people did not believe in racial inclusion in many aspects in that particular area. Now, every county has had its challenges. Every society has gone through its dark periods. The challenge with this time in Forsyth County was that it happened in 1987, and in 1987, for the national media to have come together and to hone in on this particular area, it reignited the conversations around race and justice. And as a matter of fact, Oprah Winfrey's first live show outside of Chicago was in Forsyth County, Georgia. Now, why am I sharing it with you? Because the kind of fearless and courageous leadership that it takes to talk to this generation that's dealing with the Tamir Rices and the Trayvon Martins and the Mike Browns, it's now to the point where we cannot afford to not have difficult conversations at our homes. And I'm going to share this with you if you're parents. Now, granted, I know you're here to be inspired, to have conversations, and I promise that I'm here to make sure that we all get good information, that we're all able to have a conversation. But in that same respect, I have to challenge each and every one of you. I have to challenge myself. And that is to begin the process of cutting the TV off and having conversations with your children. I would challenge all of you to get back to going out into your communities and to knowing the young men and the young women that live around you. I would challenge all of you, regardless of your political or social persuasion, to make sure that you're speaking and engaging people that might not think like you or might not talk like you. The only way we get towards healing in the United States and in repairing the brokenness of so many areas is by having courageous conversations about the things that we might not be comfortable having. When Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa, it was during the time that they were just getting out of apartheid. And I don't think I would have to give a history lesson on apartheid, but many of us, the really short version is it was a time in which black folks in South Africa were severely oppressed. They were pitted against each other. And to be quite frank with you, the ruling minority ruled with an iron fist against the black South Africans that lived in that area. And the biggest fear that many people in South Africa had at the time when Nelson Mandela became president was that the black new ruling party would have their retribution on the white South Africans. But the contrary happened. And Nelson Mandela, who had been incarcerated for 27 years, came out and instead of retaliation, ruled with compassion. He was willing to have conversation. He was willing to go beyond what the oppressors, and what the folks that did not feel confident about him or his leadership or that community. And he was able to do something that has been rarely done throughout history, and that was to bring people together. And I would say that there's dignity in compassion. There's strength in compassion. And to return to this conversation on justice, the reason why compassion is so critical in the time that we live in is because we can look, similar to the examples I gave earlier about the 60s, and understand that in 1972, the United States prison population was roughly 300 to 325,000. But today in the United States, the prison population is 2.3 million, with the majority of those numbers being from poor areas, low-income areas, and the majority, as we all know, black and brown people, especially black and brown men. And I'm not telling anybody anything new. This is a responsibility we all have. But what does this mean to you here in Georgia? Well, for starters, 88% of Georgia's prison population reads at a third grade level. Let me repeat that. 88% of Georgia's prison population reads at a third grade level, which means that our responsibility is not to be reactionary when these young men and young women are in trouble or incarcerated, but to be proactive early. And that's why I challenge you early to have these conversations, to be bold and to be courageous and to be intentional about what you talk about when you talk about it. I told you all that I'm a father. I have 3 sons. One is 8, one is 12, and one is 15. And my 8-year-old gets the same conversation, a little watered down, but the same conversation as my 15-year-old. We can't afford to assume that our children in our communities or in our families are not going to be exposed or are not going to know, because what they have that we didn't have is the internet. So a lot more times than less, they're going to know and understand and be exposed whether we have our conversations or not. So why not let them hear that from us? Another aspect of the criminal justice system that should be alarming to all of us. I had a tremendous opportunity to serve with the Obama administration on 3 White House initiatives, one of which focused specifically on the fact in which how we're treating young people in juvenile centers as it relates to the school to prison pipeline, knowing that in states like Georgia, we spend roughly $9,500 per student, but upwards $20,000, $30,000, and $50,000 per inmate, which means that we're spending 3 and 4 and 5 times as much to incarcerate than to educate. That should alarm you. That should anger you. I'm not blaming any individual. I'm not blaming any specific group. What I'm saying is that we should all feel a sense of responsibility. This year, 2 years ago, there was a quote made by a young woman, a white woman named Heather Hare, who said, "If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention." And I don't know at what point in society we got comfortable with how things are. But it's time to loosen up your tie. It's time to put on some flats, ladies. And we got to get back out in our communities. We have to walk. We have to knock on doors. We have to speak to people. We have to engage people. I'm not asking you to turn your coffee room into your job into a debate. It's not what I'm asking you. But when you see all the things that are happening in our country at this time, especially with a lot of the shootings that we're seeing, we can't solely blame that on mental health illness. We've got to understand that there's some people that have been dealing with some things for a long time. And yes, anyone who would make that kind of decision to take multiple lives at one time or any life, anytime we see that, we should understand that there's something going on with that person. But we cannot allow mental health illness alone to be the scapegoat. A tremendous amount of the work that we have to do is contingent on our ability to courageously encounter and engage other people and be sympathetic to the things that we might not share and the things that might be a little different. Our responsibility in this time as it relates to my book, which I'll close on in a second, but our responsibility as a society is to begin to have those conversations. It's not enough for us to come here today and to convene and for all of us to be here and to hear from some great speakers, and then tomorrow we wake up and we say we went to this amazing event, and by Monday of next week we're back to business as usual, because that's what happens in our country. Things happen, and then we're so distracted by everything else. And let me tell you right now, before I go even further, you deserve to be happy. You deserve to have a life outside of work. You deserve to have a day where the politics of our democracy don't have anything to do with you going fishing or you taking a vacation with your family. But that isn't an excuse for any of us to deny the things that are happening are happening. And I would challenge all of you to begin to focus on what is going to be your next step. What is it that has inspired you, and what action is going to come out of that inspiration? That's really where we stand as a society today. John F. Kennedy once said, "An error does not become a mistake until we refuse to correct it." And there are a lot of things that we've all done wrong, or that we could have adjusted, or that we could change. But it's only until this changes and this changes that we will begin to make the adjustments in our personal lives to be better, not just for ourselves and not just for our families, but to society as a whole. So I want to get ready to close out by talking about progress and about the whole pretty much underlining reason why I'm up here today, which again deals with compassion. But I want to begin to close out by giving you another quote. Obviously, I'm up here and I'm driven by so many different areas. The first one is that, and I want you all to take this as a group as a whole, and even with some of your coworkers that may be here. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to run fast, run alone. If you want to run far, run with others. I want you to think of your tribe, not in the sense of Republican or Democrat, black or white. I want you to think of your tribe in the sense of your group, the people you are consistently around more than the personal time you may spend with your spouse or with your children. And I want you to think, who's in your tribe? What does that look like? And how can you affect change in the circle that you're in? I want you to think about speaking up and being bold in meetings. There's a video that I watched on leadership, and in the video, it starts off with a family. 4 members of the family. The father makes a suggestion, and his suggestion is that they take a trip into the city, which is about 75 miles away. He makes a suggestion. Immediately, his wife says, "Hey, that's a good idea." And then his daughter turns to his wife and says, "Dad, I think that's a great idea. We should all go. We should get ready to leave." And then the spouse, the husband of the daughter, says, "I think it's great. When are we going to leave? Let's go ahead and jump in the car." They take this trip. They go all the way down. They're miserable because the car doesn't have any air conditioning in it. They take this long drive that's not on a scenic route. They get there. They eat. There's barely any talking. They get back to the house. And the first thing the mom says is, "Well, I didn't want to go down there." And then the daughter says, "Well, if you didn't want to go down there, what'd you say it? I was just saying I wanted to go because you wanted to go." And then the husband of the daughter says, "Well, I was trying to go because I'm the only one that's not a blood relative, and I didn't want to make any of you upset." And then the dad sitting by the window says, "Well, I just made a suggestion hoping somebody would say something different." Now, what's the point of that story? Leadership isn't about being complacent. Leadership isn't about being average. Leadership isn't about just sitting down and doing things because everybody else wants to do it. It's about taking a stance and being willing to do things and say things even when it might be uncomfortable, even when it might not be popular, even when it might not be in the best interest of everyone there. And too often, many of us are in our churches, and we have a chance to speak up and we don't. We're in the boardroom and we have a chance to speak up and we don't. We're in our community groups, we have a chance to speak up and we don't. We're in our job settings and someone says, "What do you think we should do?" And because you don't want to compromise your position or be honest and forthright, we tend to draw back and be more passive. And one of the main challenges of society is that we have been too comfortable with being complacent. The last quote I hope I give you is by Malcolm X, and he made a quote about progress. And Malcolm said, "If you stick a knife in my arm 9 inches and you pull it out 6, that's not progress." He said, "If you take the blade and you pull it all the way out," no, he said, "If you take the blade 9 and pull it out 6, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress." Malcolm said, progress is when the knife is completely removed, the wound is cared for and healed, and you give me a chance to heal through the blow. We have not allowed society to heal. I mentioned earlier about mental health illness, and I did not, to be clear, I'm not writing off mental health illness as not an important issue in the United States. What I said earlier was that we should not make it the scapegoat for every time an issue happens, because being bold, being courageous, being unapologetic about the type of country we all desire to live in has nothing to do with being passive. Now, what I'm talking about in this aspect about progress and talking about mental health illness is one of the reasons that we have to allow healing is because one of the main issues that we're dealing with in society is mental health illness. It is anxiety. It is suicide. Where I live, there is a challenge because now the opioid crisis is seemingly taking over so many areas, especially suburban areas. And one of the challenges that many folks will have is that when it was crack cocaine, there was incarceration as the remedy, but now that it's opioids, it's treatment and there's resources and funding. Compassion doesn't go back 30 or 40 years and say, "Well, you didn't help us, we're not going to help you." Because many people may have a valid argument for why they might not want to help, why they might not want to go in that direction. But I'm here to tell you today that the compassion I'm talking about is the compassion it took for there to be a nonviolent civil rights movement in the 60s and in the 50s. That's the kind of compassion that I'm talking about. When I wrote my book, I was offered 2 deals. I since self-published and I wrote it as an independent author, but when I wrote my book, I was offered several deals with dollar amounts that were pretty attractive. But I turned them down, and I'm going to tell you why. The first deal I was offered for a significant amount wanted me to be heavy on the left. They wanted me to write a book anti-everything except my belief and value system. And I turned it down because my father, who was a United States Army Ranger, he taught me tough times don't last, tough people do. And I didn't want to write a book that was divisive. I wanted to write something where I was a part of the solution and not the problem. The second offer I was given wanted to give me a little more liberty and creativity in writing. But one of the things that came along with that liberty and creativity was a much larger percentage and a much more limited platform to be able to go out and speak. Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm talking about right now is integrity. And knowing that when you've been given something that's fueled by purpose, your responsibility is to take that and to make the tough decisions. Similar to the example I gave you of the family that drove into the city that none of them wanted to go to, you have to make a decision at some point about what kind of path you want to set, about what kind of course and what kind of journey you're willing to take. So I decided to write a book that focused on starting off with the 1936 Olympics when Jesse Owens had to compete in a country that was anti-black, anti-Jew, anti-equality, anti-everything, based on the regime that was in power. And a lot of times we place an emphasis on where he went and not where he was sent from. You see, during that time, there were still Jim Crow laws in the South. There was still a fragmented United States. So he had a difficult choice. And this is what motivated me to write. His choice was to represent a country that treated him as a second or third class citizen to compete in a country that didn't want him there. You see, the power of identity is so critical in the time we're in because the things we don't want to talk about are the things that make us strong. The instances of what we had to endure as a nation and where we are as a people are what will make this generation understand their personal responsibility. So my book is a journey from Jesse Owens' challenges and triumphs all the way to Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. Why? Because we tend to get involved in arguments and debates based on emotion and not understanding the underlying reasons why these things are important. Sure, civics is important to teach in schools, and I think they should do a better job. Sure, students should be able to graduate and compete at the best levels, and I agree with that. But what about the responsibility on all of us to teach them how to be good citizens? One of the most difficult decisions I ever made was moving my family into a county that had its own challenges that, quite frankly, people still remembered and related to. Because as a father, I had to make a decision based on the fact that you only get one chance to raise children. You don't get a do-over. You don't get a second chance to raise a kid from when they're born to when they graduate. And that's why I'm even looking forward to hearing Mike Brown Sr. God forbid any of us would have to endure the loss of a child, and if you did, my heart goes out to you. But I'm here because we had to make tough decisions. And the book that I wrote was based off of 7 social sins outlined by Gandhi in 1925. And if you don't know, this is the 150th anniversary or birthday of Gandhi this year. And I began to write. And as I began to write, I started to realize that even in my objectivity, I was also a part of the problem because my perspective was one-sided. And I'll share with you why. You see, when I first moved, let me back up. My father joined the military. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. We moved to Vicenza, Italy. So I grew up overseas. So my ability to interact with people as an adult was based on the fact that being in a military family, I had lived around so many different communities. I've interacted with so many different people. I've been around different cultures, and I've been around different religions, and I was able to adapt. And as a matter of fact, this might be funny to some and strange to others, but when I got off the plane from Vicenza, Italy in 1988, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and all these things happened, the first thing I wanted when I got to the airport was a Confederate flag shirt. Look at the silence in the faces. But I wanted it because I grew up watching the Dukes of Hazzard. I didn't know anything about the Confederate South. Remember, my family is from Barbados. My family didn't grow up in a segregated South. My family came here, and I saw the shirt, and my father gave me a look to let me know really clearly and directly, you're not getting that shirt. And the lady sitting behind the register, who happened to be a white woman, looked at me like I had lost my mind. But that's the innocence of a child. And the innocence of our young men and women have not only been robbed and taken away, but because we've refused to have challenging and difficult conversations. Like where I live, somebody told me one day, they said, you know, Daniel, the way we get past this is we stop talking about it. And I would argue that that's the exact way to make it persist, because our children are living messages to a world we will never see. Our prayer is that our children and the generations that are coming behind us will outlive us. And in writing the last chapter of my book, I highlight an area of a rally where there was a group that wanted to do a Unite the Right pro-Trump rally. And there was a prominent figure from the Tea Party movement who was a white man who was hosting the rally. And then there was a Black Lives Matter group out of New York who came to protest the rally. And in the midst of all the craziness that we've seen over the last 3.5 years, what happened next was really probably one of the most inspiring things I ever read about, and I actually had a chance to speak to one of the gentlemen in writing my book. The gentleman that was holding the Trump rally calmed down the crowd, and he looks to the hundreds of people that came there to support this Trump movement, and he looks at the guy from Black Lives Matter and he says, I want you to come on stage. And he said to the crowd, he said, you guys believe in the First Amendment, right? And everybody said, we believe in the First Amendment. He said, you guys believe in democracy and patriotism, right? He said, yes. So then he said, well, this guy here has just as many rights as we do. And we're going to bring him on stage, and we're going to give him 2 minutes. And no matter if you like what he says or you don't like what he says, whether you agree or you don't agree, he's an American. And many of us in this room, from our ancestors, from our families, from people that we may have known and we may have encountered, we fundamentally understand that there are folks that have had to endure more than we ever know. But what I'm here to say to you today, and what I want to leave you with, is that the challenges that we're facing today come from our ability not to be passive, and I hate the word tolerant, because quite frankly, when you think of tolerant, that just means you put up with me. But for those of us that are willing to be bold, and those of us that are willing to be courageous, and those of us who are willing to invite people into our spaces that we might not always agree with, we might not think like, they might pray differently, they may vote differently. Our responsibility as a people, as a country, as a democracy, and as a society is to do the exact thing that measures all of us, in the words that Dr. King left with us, which is the true measure of a man again, is not where he stands in times of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. Your responsibility today, as I leave you, is to measure yourself internally on what you are doing with your life, with your decisions, with your leadership, and with the position you play at home, with your families, or in your spaces. Thank you all so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.